Okay, so I'm going to assume at this point that if we made it this far, that we do have a working database. So if I go over here and I go to, yes, better? Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go to P-SQL. Now, P-SQL, again, I'm not going to do a ton of commands for P-SQL. I'm going to connect to my Twitter SQL test database. Okay, and let's just see if I can't find the database. I might have called it some Twitter DB test. Twitter DB test. And if I do D, I'll see that I've got a couple of tables. These sequential tables, don't worry about it. You're not touching them directly. This has to do with the IDs that end up getting auto-generated for the users in the tweets table. If I look at any of these tables, so if I do D tweets, see that I've got a ID, content, and a user ID. If I see D users, I see that I just have an ID and name. And if I say select star from users, I see Mo and Larry. You guys might be wondering, boy, how did I get those high IDs in there? I must have been deleting a lot. Well, we're going to talk about why those are high. This is my test database that I'm using, as opposed to maybe the database that I would actually use for my application. And if I say select star from tweets, I'll see that I've got my IDs for my users. So I've got Mo that's got a couple of tweets and Larry has one tweet. Okay? And we'll talk about how we get this data. So my goal is to do something like this. I'm in a directory, nothing here, empty. My goal is to do something like this, to say npm test, and to run my tests. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I can't really do that yet, I'm going to do npm init. Okay? And there's a couple of things that I know that I'm going to need right off the bat. I know that I'm going to need Postgres in order for this to work. I also know that I'm going to need to write some tests. So I'm just going to say npm install Postgres. I'm going to save it. Okay. I'm also going to need npm install, and I'm going to need Mocha, and I'm going to need Chai. Yeah, I will. Yeah, let me get especially with the colors and stuff. You guys can move closer too if you want. Okay. So I want Mocha and I want Chai because I want to do my testing. So both these are going to get installed. Again, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to write npm test and to test out my application. So right now I say npm test, and the reason why I get this echo popping out here is because if I look at my package JSON file, this is what I have. And I'm going to get rid of this. Okay? Now, I'm going to put a couple of things here. One of the things I know I'm going to need to do when I run my tests, okay? When I run my tests, I know my tests are going to have to interact with the database. Okay? And I want to specify for my test what database I should be using. I don't want to hard code my database in code. Okay? Because if I end up deploying my application somewhere, my connection strength to my database might be different than what it is on my desktop. It also might be different from what I want when I run my tests. Very often when you run tests, you want a test database. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say connection equals Postgres / localhost, and mine is Twitter DB test. That's going to be my connection string. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say nodemon. And I know that my Mocha files are in my node modules, and I know they're under Mocha. Mocha has a bin directory with a Mocha command. This will start Mocha. Okay? There's other ways to do it. There's something called the Mocha CLI, where you could just type Mocha if you want to. But this is not a huge stretch to see.
You're missing a G.
Thank you. me give myself a little room here. This is not a huge path to get to my Mocha files. If you want, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Okay. Again, the only thing that I'm putting here is my connection string because I need to have my connection string. There's one switch that I'm going to add later for my NodeMon because NodeMon looks at JS files. NodeMon doesn't look at HTML files. But when I do my routes, I want to test my routes. I want it to look at HTML files. So again, one line of code here. I could have added the connection string later on, but I know I'm going to end up needing it. And if I run npm test again, the error that I get is that by default, and you could configure this, by default, Mocha is going to look for tests in a very specific folder. It's going to look for tests in a test folder. We don't have a test folder. If I go back over here, and I add a test folder, and what I want to test here is I'm going to test my tweet model spec.js. Right, so basically this is the model that I'm testing. It's going to be my tweet model. If I had a lot of models here, I would probably just create a folder here called models. And within the models folder, I would say tweet.spec.js. But this is what I want to start out with, okay? Instead of starting out with my routes, I think everyone would probably agree the most complicated part of what they probably wrote was dealing with the Postgres part of it. Getting the connection to the database right, writing the right queries, getting the right results. And I think you found it pretty frustrating that you sort of had to keep on going in. Maybe you got some bad data in the database, you had to delete it after a while, or you went in there and you have to go through that process of going through the website and going to the particular pages. Here we're going to be able to write these tests without ever opening up a browser. So if we go back here, we should end up at least getting this to pass. So how are we going to start here? Well, what I want to do is let's start over here, and we'll say what we're going to describe is tweet. Right? This is our tweet model. If you think about it, our tweet model is going to be able to do a couple of different things. A tweet model really has to do three things. Okay? A tweet model has to get tweets for a specific user, okay, and create a tweet. That's it. That's really all your tweet model has to be able to do. So now if we go over here, first thing I like to do is to say it exists. And I'm going to go over here and I'll say, well, what do I expect? I expect tweet to be okay. That's going to describe its existence. Of course, I'm going to need my expectation library, which is going to be expect, require, shy, expect. And if I go back over here, I'll see that tweet is not defined. And we'll go over here and we'll say tweet and we'll say require. And I'm going to go up one level. I'm going to assume I have a models folder, and within it, I've got a file called tweet. Of course, that is not the case at the moment. So let's go over here. We'll create a folder called models. By the way, is it people trying to type along with me? Don't. Just watch. You know what's going to happen? You're going to say, hey, you know, mine's not working. I got the exact same thing you have. And the fact is you won't have the exact same thing. And all you're going to be doing is paying attention to typing. So don't type. Don't type. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to export a module. And let's think about, well, we have an existence. What do we want to have happen? Well, let's do a describe here. And we'll say describe when there are no tweets. Well, actually, let's describe a method. So when you're describing a method, we're going to describe the method getTweets. And we'll put another description here, and we'll say, in the context of when there are no tweets. And what do we expect when this is the case? Well, returns an empty array, right? If there are no tweets, we're going to get an empty array for get tweets. How are we going to call get tweets? We know that this is going to be asynchronous, right? So we could say, hey, look, tweet, get tweets, and we're going to pass in a callback function. We expect to get our tweets back. It's going to be asynchronous. When we go over here, we're going to say, what do we expect? We expect tweets dot length to equal 0. So one thing that you're going to run into here is whenever you're dealing with something asynchronous in a expectation, what happens is that the test will just end up running. You have to be very specific and say, hey, look, since this is asynchronous, okay, I've got an if block here. Don't call the expectations until I tell you to call the expectations. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, don't call this expectation until we get down here. And we get an error. We never even make it that far. It says tweet get tweets is not a function. Let's go over here. And we're going to say get tweets. And we're going to pass in a function. And let's actually, I found this a little bit easier to do this sort of pattern. Get tweets. It's going to be get tweets. And we'll put this function get tweets over here. Of course, now we've got another error that we're going to time out because we're never calling our callback. But if I go over here, I could get my test to pass. I'm passing in some kind of callback, and I'll just call back with an empty array. And my test pass, that's great. Now, we know that's not really how we want our test to run. What we want to be able to do is we want to be able to connect to our database, and we want to run a query, and we want to get our tweets. So as we start writing that, let's think about what this would look like. Well, what we really want to be able to do here is we want to have some way of connecting to our database. Now, keep in mind, we've got one model here for tweets, but we could have models for other things as well in our application. So let's say that somewhere around here, we've got some method that we're going to end up using to basically connect to the database. So this is going to look something like this. We could go over here and we could say db connect, and we'll get back a connection object. And somewhere in here, we'll query our database. Okay? Of course, db connect doesn't exist, db doesn't exist. Well, so now we start to build this out. We say db equals, don't forget we're in the models folder. We'll go up one level. Go up one level to db, and we'll open up one more file here. Theoretically, we could have written tests for db as well, but we could build this out. We've seen this code already. So let's see what db is going to look like. db is only going to have one method, and that's going to be connect. And here, it's just one function. I'm going to just put it like this. And so what's this connect going to look like? Well, I'm going to pass in a callback function, which is going to, when it's called, it's going to give me my connection because making the connection is asynchronous. Okay? And so I'm going to go up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this variable called db. And when I go in here, I'm going to say, hey, look, if in fact you're already connected, if db is holding on to your connection, notice this return is important. Who was it in the channel that posted last night, right? That was the issue, okay? So if in fact I have my db, I got to get the hell out of it, okay? So I'm going to get out of there, and I'm going to make my callback with db. Keep in mind, I want to make this clear. When you have a callback function, you can't return anything inside of a callback function, okay? Your callback function here you have access to this callback function. You could call the callback function. The only reason I'm doing return is I don't want anything to happen underneath there. Okay? I could have easily done if and else. I do return. To me, it's more readable. Okay? So if that's the case, well, how are we ever going to get our DB object? Well, what I'm going to do here is I'll say client equals new Postgres client, and I'll say process environment connection. And if we're going to do that, let's bring in our PG is require Postgres. And if that's my connection, and one thing I can do with my connection, I can tell my client to connect. Now this, again, is a callback function. And all I'm doing now is I'm focusing on one thing. I'm focusing on connecting to the database. And here, what I want to do, and the other thing is I don't want to keep on connecting to the database. I just want to connect once and use that same connection. So once I end up coming over here, there's a possibility of getting an error, but the second parameter that'll get passed here is the actual connection object. And so what I'm going to do here is just to catch my errors. I'll say, hey, look, if there is an error, throw the error. What that does is that also gets the hell out of there. It ends up throwing an exception. I don't expect this to happen, right? But if it does happen, I want to see what that exception looks like. Might that happen? Sure. If my Postgres server is not running, if I give a bad connection string, that could end up happening. Otherwise, what I have now is my DB equals my connection, and I can do a callback with my DB. So now I should have access to my connection, and if we go back and see what's happening here, we should just be timing out again. Okay? And if I go back, now I could start to think about what my query is going to look like. Once I'm connected to my database, I'm going to actually break this up into a couple of parts here. I'm going to say query equals, and I'll say select from tweets. Let's be more specific. I'm going to select tweets ID, tweets content, tweets user ID, and I'm also going to select the users.name. In mine there is. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, where is this from? This is going to be from tweets, going users. On tweets, user ID equals users.id. So this is going to be my query. Again, this allows me to do a multi-line string. And this will come in handy later on. I'm going to say params equals an empty array. And my SQL statement itself is to take my connection, query, with my params. And again, I get either an error or result. I'll go over here and I'll say, hey, look, if I have an error, again, I don't expect it, but if I do, I'm throwing it. Okay? There are other ways to maybe handle the error gracefully. Again, I don't expect this to happen. I'm querying from my database. Otherwise, I'm going to call my callback with my result.rows. And if I go over here, and I go back here, okay, I have a problem. Okay, so it did in fact get my rows, and it makes sense that I showed you my database. My database does have 3 rows in it. Okay, so I have a way in my test of clearing out my data when I'm writing my tests. So very often, what you have is some task that cleans out your database. What I want to basically do is I want to truncate, empty out my users table and my tweets table. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually, before every single test, I want to make sure that I'm in the state that I want to be in. So before every test, I'm going to put a function here. And again, this is going to be asynchronous. Whenever you're dealing with a database Things are going to be asynchronous. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, hey, look, tweet, truncate yourself. And when you do, I'm going to go over here and call done. Now, of course, this is not going to work because there's no truncate. But look what we sort of have now. If I go to my tweets, I could write a method called truncate. And I could go over here. Truncate, again, is going to be one of these things that's going to take a call back. And when I go to truncate, let me actually put it up here on the top so you can maybe see a little better. When I go to truncate, what I'm going to do, same thing I did here, connect. This is my way of connecting to the database. If the connection is being connected for the first time, that's fine. It might take a little bit longer. If the connection already exists, I'll end up getting it back much faster. And what I'm going to do over here when I call connect, I'm going to run a query. And my query here is going to be, you could do this. You could actually put separate statements and separate them by a semicolon. I'm going to say truncate table users, truncate, and let me actually do it in the right order, just in case we had, I don't have it, I didn't do a foreign key, but just in case there was a foreign key, if I deleted my users before I deleted my tweets, I might get an error message because there's a connection between the users and the tweets table. So let's say I'm going to truncate table tweets, truncate table users. That's going to be my query. And I'm going to say, hey, connection, run this query. You don't have any parameters. Again, we're either going to get a function or a result set. I don't really care about the result set, but if there's an error for some reason, I'll throw it. Otherwise, I'm just going to do my callback. Okay? So before every test that runs in this test suite, in this describe block, okay, I will truncate all my data. So now if I run this, returns an empty array. Okay? Again, the code that you're writing for your test is probably a lot more. There's some stuff that we had to do to write that connection object. But sort of building it out, we could think, okay, that's great, that works. At least we're able to truncate data. We know we could connect to the database. Well, what do we want to do next? So what we could end up doing next is we could end up testing out, well, what happens when there is data. So we'll go over here. And you can sort of lose track of your, let me work from the top down. Let's say I'm going to describe when there are tweets. And what's my expectation? Well, I'll say I expect there are 3 tweets. I expect to have 3 tweets here. So what am I going to do? I'm going to say tweet, get tweets, and I'll put my callback function in here to get my tweets back. This is asynchronous. My expectation is going to be I expect tweets.length to equal, and we'll say that we're going to have them equal 3. And again, since this is asynchronous, I need it done here, and I need it done here. Now, of course, when I run this, I'm going to get an error that says, hey, look, you really got 0, right? You expected to get 3. So not only are we going to have a truncate, but in this describe block, we're going to put, not a describe block, and this before each, so before this test runs, we're going to put something in here that says tweet seed. And again, when it's done seeding, we're going to do a callback. And we'll go over here. And we'll pass in a done. And we'll say done. So in other words, the way that this works is that if you have a before each up on the top of your describe block, that's going to happen before every single test, okay? But immediately before this test that runs, it's going to add some data to the database. So now if we go to run this, let's go back here. Of course, we don't have a seed function, so let's now write our seed function. If we go over here, we're going to write a seed function. Let's see what that looks like. So we're going to have this seed function. And let's just think about how this is going to work. We want to create 3 tweets. We want to create 2 from Mo and 1 from Larry. So let's assume that we have some method which we'll call create tweet. And create tweet is going to pass in, we'll start out with our, we can end up passing in our user. So here actually we'll say, we'll do our content first. So we'll say hello, Mo, and we'll pass in a callback when we're done with that tweet. And we'll want to create another tweet. And this will be Mo again. And we'll do another one. And this will be Larry. So if we go over here, and then once we're done with creating these tweets, we'll do our callback, right? You see how this stuff, even with just running your seeding function, you can see how your functionality is starting to come out. We're sort of hoping that we have some method called create tweet, which we don't. And that's what we're going to have to run.
So this goes into production. This is a production file, obviously. It's going to have this stuff that's only really used for testing, only for dev, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's okay because it's test driven. We don't mind actually having stuff built into it.
Well, I mean, I think it's a good question. And what will often happen, you are using this code for your test, but it is interacting. So there's 2 methods that probably are only going to be used for testing. Right. Okay. That's going to be your truncate and your seed. If you were concerned about it, what you could do is you could basically say, hey, look, all my test databases are going to have a name of test. And you could look at your connection string and say, if my connection string does not have the word test in it, I'm not doing it. That's one way of protecting your production data, just in case some developer tried to call it in production code. Now, people should have a bit more sense. It's not like this is going to be open to anybody. You just got to worry about the other people on your team or yourself calling it inadvertently. So let's go over here. When we do this, let's think about what our create tweet method is going to look like. So the create tweet method, so keeping our eyes on this thing, is going to have content, a name, and a callback. And we know that when we end up doing this, the first thing that we're going to have to do is we need to get the user ID. So we're going to have to create the user and then create the tweet for that user. Okay? Right now, I'm assuming simplistically that I'm not worried about duplicating users. I'm going to fix that in a little bit. But I'm going to go over here and say when I go to create a tweet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say db connect, get my connection. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, hey, look, connection. What I want you to do, let's actually set up our query. We'll say QRY, insert into users, name, values, and the way that Postgres handles values is it's index-based, and my params are going to be an array, and this is going to be my name. So now I could run my query. I could say connection.query, and it's going to be my query, my params, function, error, result. Now, if in fact I have an error, again, just to keep things simple, I'm going to throw it. Okay? What I really want to do is I want to get back the ID of the user. So Postgres gives you, and all databases do this, it gives you the ability. In Postgres, the syntax is returning ID. So this is now going to give us the ability of getting the ID back. And if we end up getting the ID back, what's going to happen, we're going to have a user ID. And the user ID is going to be result.rows, our first row. We really only have one row. That's all we'll get back. And the ID. That's going to be the user ID. And now we could go over here, and we're going to do another query here. And we could say, use that same variable. Insert into tweets, content, user ID, values, 1, 2. And I'll say my params this time are going to be my content and my user ID. Again, what I could do here is say, hey, look, my connection, I still have. I'm going to run this new query. I'm going to run it with these params. I'm going to have a callback function, which is either going to get an error or result. And I'll go over here, and I'll say, if in fact you have an error, throw the error. Again, I'm thinking happy paths here. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call back. Now, again, if I was worried about getting my tweet back, that would be one thing, but I'm not really worried about getting that tweet back. I just want to make sure that that tweet ended up getting created. So for every single tweet that we try to create, we're going to insert a user, someone into the users table. We're going to get their ID, and we're going to insert into the tweets table. Again, things where you might mess up here, where I've messed up is maybe doing $0, or mixing up your variables here, right? This is our content. That's our user ID. We're passing in our content first. And if we go to run this.
You only break that up because of that returning ID, kind of? Or no?
When you say break it up, let's be very careful with our words. Okay, it's very important. Okay? When you say break it up, I think what you're saying is nesting.
Yeah, nesting.
And the reason why you have to nest is that if one thing depends upon another thing, people are walking out. This is unbelievable. No, just kidding. The reason why you have to nest things is that if one thing is happening before something else and is dependent upon something else, that user needs to be inserted first because I need to get the user ID. Right. So it's not that it's really getting broken apart. It's that it's happening. Let's use this word. It's an important word. It's happening sequentially. Asynchronously and sequentially.
And returning is just a Postgres thing?
Returning is just Postgres. Other languages have different syntax. Okay? Once I run this, my tests end up passing. It's great. Okay? I could almost be done here. Again, did we open up a browser yet? No browser, right? Let's go over here and let's actually just run another expectation. We expect that there are 2 users, right? Because we did mode twice, right? We're going to be using users by name. Names are going to be unique. So we expect our functionality to only have 2 users. Well, we don't have a get users, so let's create one. It's fairly easy to do. We'll say get users. To give us back users. And we'll say users.length. We'll start out getting it to pass. Okay, and then we'll realize that it really should be failing. So we'll go over here and we'll add one more method.
I have a question on create. So in this case, the only way to create a user is to create a tweet with it, with the user.
A tweet has to have a valid user ID.
And if it exists, it's just.
We haven't done it yet. We haven't done it yet. Right now, we've got a little bit of a problem. We've got a one-to-one correspondence. However many tweets we have, we're going to have users. That's not what we want. Okay? This is our first cut. So let's go over here, and we'll do a get users. It's going to be a pretty quick one. Doesn't get past anything except for a callback. And we'll go over here, and again, we'll do our handy DB connect. We get our connection string. We'll get our connection string, we'll run a query, select star from users. No parameters. We either get an error or we get a result. We get an error, we throw it. If not, we're going to do our callback with the result.rows. Now we've got this method get users, and this passes well, but it's not really what we want, right? What we really want is we want 2 users. And that fails, okay? So what we really want to have here, this is sort of helping us build it out, is that instead of going in here and writing this query, what we really want to do is we really want to be able to either create a user or get a user. Let's be even more clear about it. We really just want to get the user's ID. That's all we need. Okay? So if we were to go and modify this, I'm going to comment. I'll go over here and I'll say, imagine instead what we're going to do is we'll connect and we'll say create or get user ID. Name, function, user ID. So what we really want to do is we want to get this user ID, and then if we have this user ID, then we could go up here and we could take this code, which is here, make sure I get all of it here. Let's see where that ends. It's actually, well, this can go. One of these could probably go. I could go up here. This is what you call callback hell, which promises are going to help us avoid. What we want to do here is we want to create or get the user ID. And if, in fact, we can get the user ID, we'll have the user ID, and we could then run our query. Okay? So now let's actually run this code. And what we'll do here, we don't have this method. So now we're going to have one more method. By the way, this is not, I don't have to, let's be just clear about something. I don't have to expose this method. Okay? This is going to be used internally just for this module. Not exposing it. You don't want to expose it. You don't have to expose it. And I could go up here, and I'll say function create or get user ID. This is going to take a name and a callback. Again, when I go in here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect, and I'll get my connection. Again, if the connection exists, just get it back. And what I'll do here is I'll say connection.query, select ID from users, where name equals $1. And this is going to be my name. And this is either going to get me an error or result. So if in fact I have an error, throw the error. Okay? Now, even if I don't have an error, what I'm going to do is I'll say, hey, look, if results.rows.length is greater than 0, that means I've got the user ID and I want to call back, but I also want to get the hell out of there because I'm done at this point. So I say return callback result.rows0.id. Otherwise, I have another query that I need to write. And the other query that I need to write is basically now to insert into the users table. So I'll use my connection, and I'll say connection query.
You don't need an else, right?
I don't need an else because in either of those cases, I'm gone. I'm out. Either I threw an exception or I left the callback function. Okay? If I decided not to use that return, again, I'm using that return because I don't really like else's if I could avoid them. So I'm going to go over here and I'll say insert into users name, right? We did this once before. Values, $1. Params are going to be the name. Either I'm going to get an error or a result. And I'll go over here and I'll say, if I get an error, throw the error. If not, I'm going to call back result.rows. And there's one thing I forgot to do, result.rows ID. And what I forgot to do was my returning of the ID. So this is either going to find the user and return that user's ID, or it's going to create the user and it's going to return that ID of the user. Okay? So now, if we go back here, results, probably I used results instead of result. So let's see, this is telling me on line 15. And so it's not results.row. And I used to do that. It's, with other drivers, a lot of times you just get the results back. Here with Postgres, you get a result, and the rows are the actual data. So let's go and modify this, and now my test passed. Now, there's only one more method that we really need to write. So think about this for a second. By writing our get tweets method, we actually wrote our create tweets method. Our create tweets method is done. We don't even have to test it. Tested it. We tested it because we're calling it within our seed, and we're getting the data that we expect to get back maybe. Maybe. We're just looking at the length. We're operating under some assumptions here. Let's just do one other thing here, and this happens too, is that there are 3 tweets. And let's also say that there are 2 tweets from Mo. Well, how are we going to do that? Well, instead of creating a new method here, let's go over here. And let's say that we have the option of sending in, or let's say that this method is going to expect the name of a user. Okay? Let's say that this method is going to expect the name of a user, Mo. So if that's the case, then we just need to go up and say, hey, look, in this case, we're not passing in a user to test this out. Where else did we do this? Tweets.length is 3. And when there are no tweets and we call this method, again, we're not calling it with a user here. Now we just have to modify our getTweets method to specify, hey, look, you know what? When you go to get the tweets, we're going to pass you a name. We might not. It might be null. If it's null, don't worry about it. And we'll go over here, and this is kind of a nice thing that we have this outside of here, because we could say, look, if in fact you have a name, if name is not null, right? So if in fact there was a name that I passed in here, I want to modify this query, and I want to add to this query plus equals where name of the table is users, users.name equals $1. Also, my params, I want to push onto it my name. So now, instead of my params being here, I'm up here. So I go in here with my params and my query. If I have a name, I modify the query, call it with the params. In which case, unless I miss something, right? And that's because I think when we did that, we didn't modify the test. There are 2 tweets from Mo, right? If I wanted to write a third text, I could say, there is 1 tweet from Larry. And I could go over here and say, I expect this to be 1 if we're using Larry. And that should pass as well. Okay? So in fact, our entire tweet, I'm not saying it's simple, okay? But I'm saying you can do it with some test-driven development to get your model written. Okay? Trying to think if there was anything else that, oh, there's one other thing that I want to do. So, you know, I would like it if when I get my tweets back, I would like it if I have my tweet and my tweet has an ID and my tweet has some content. But I would also like my tweet to have, instead of just having a name for the user, I think it would be nice if my tweet also had a user object. Okay? So my tweet should have a content, should have an ID, it should have a property for user that should be a nested object. So what does that mean? That means that if I was to go over here, I could do for either one of these guys, but I could go over here and I could say, well, when I'm dealing with, let's say, Larry's tweet, I'm going to say I expect tweets 0 user.name to equal Larry. Seems reasonable, right? So I want to nest it so I don't have this object that's sitting there. It sort of makes sense that a tweet has a user has an ID, and a user also has a name. So if I go to run that, this is obviously not going to happen. And it'll say, hey, look, you're trying to get me to read the name of user. There ain't no user, right? And this is where you could console log stuff out if you wanted to. Console log tweets 0. And if we come up here, here's our tweet. So right now it's very flat. I don't want it to be flat. What I want it to be is have a user property where the ID, now you guys see why I have these big numbers, right? We run a lot of tests. I want to have an ID for my user, and I want to have a name for my user. So what I'm going to do is get this to pass, let me kill this. I mean, get rid of that. Let me go over to my tweet. And when I go to get my tweets, instead of just getting my results back, I'm going to say tweets result.rows map. This is a very, very common thing where you're going to take the data, and this is one of the reasons why we're going to find out that people use ORMs. Very often you're taking your data and you are, I call it massaging your data. You're massaging how your data is in your database, and you're massaging it into the objects that you want to have, right, in your program. I want this nested structure. I don't have that nested structure in my database. I've got relations that give me my data. I've got these joins that give me my data, but I don't have these objects, okay? And so what I can do here is for every one of these rows, you look at what I have, I've got my content, I've got my user ID, I've got my name, and I could return a new object. And this is going to be content is equal to row.content. I could say ID is equal to row.id. I could say user and give it a new object and say the ID of the user is going to be the row. You see how I got it up here? It's the user ID. And I could say the name of the user is going to be the row.name. By the way, in my program, if I wanted to call the name the username, I could do that too. Okay? I have the ability to do that massaging and change how the data is coming back from the database. So now once I do that, ID. Oh, thank you. And also, I think I forgot one other thing. I don't want to return result.rows. I want to return tweets. Now, everything passes. So when you look at it, 6 silly little tests, but now I've got these tests. I can make modifications to things, and as long as these tests run, at least I've got some confidence that things haven't broken in my code. If I go to refactor things, maybe I find another way of making the connection. Maybe I start to use promises or something along those lines, but I could still make sure that my code passes. Now, that does it for the model, okay? Now, let's write some tests for our routes. The routes tests, I think, in a way, are a little bit easier. So I'm going to test I just have a few routes. So I'm going to say routes.spec.js. And I'm going to describe my routes. And I'm also going to describe, in my routes, I'll say, hey, look, these are routes. I'll describe this. And what's my expectation here? Well, I'm going to make an expectation. And I'm going to say it returns the home page. So I want to say, how do I do that? How do I write that test? Well, right now, first of all, we don't even have an Express application here. But it would be nice if we had some kind of client that could hit our application, that could hit our Express application. Imagine if we had some client and we could say to our client, hey, look, hey, client, you can get request to slash, okay? And I'm going to expect 200 response, okay? And on top of that, when the response is finished, let me know if there's an error and give me the result. And I've got to let these tests know when they're supposed to run. So this is going to be asynchronous as well. And if in fact I have an error, I'll say if error, okay? I'm going to say I'm done, but there's the way that this is done is to actually say, look, let me get out of here. I am done. I had an error with this request. And if not, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my expectation library and say, hey, look, result.text, I expect it to contain the word welcome. It'd be nice if I had something like this. Of course, I'm going to need my expectation library. The problem is, what the hell is client? Well, there is a NPM module called supertest. And what supertest will do is supertest will spin up a server, okay, and load your Express application. Your Express application is basically just middleware that handles requests and responses. So if a server can spin up and handle those requests and responses, then it can examine those requests and responses, and it can return them to you, and you can write some tests on them. So what would that look like? Well, first of all, I'm going to say my client, and I'm going to require supertest. The supertest gives me, basically exports a function that, and I'm one level down here. I'm going to go up, and I'm going to say I've got an app somewhere. Now, this doesn't exist. This is going to break. It's going to break because supertest is not installed. It's also going to break because I don't have an app. So let's install those things. We should see that this is going to break all over the place. Doesn't have supertest. npm install supertest. Save dev. That's just for dev. We also know that we're going to need Express. And this will just save. And we'll go back, and I'll add an app. All right? And this you've seen before. Express equals require Express. App, I call Express. And I want to export Express. That's my application. And now if I go back here, I get an interesting message. 404. Found your application. What are we missing from our application? No routes, right? Express is made up of routes. We have no routes, so we never get passed into our expectation block because we have no routes. So let's go over here and just get our test to pass. And we'll say function, request, response, next. And I'll go over here, and I will say, just to get it to pass, welcome. So I exceeded my timeout. I always make this mistake. The thing that I forget to do is that in my test here, for my routes, I need to actually call my done over here. Because again, I didn't have an error. This is my expectation. And at that point, I'm ready for it to run my expectation. So now I can go in here and I could say done, and my tests end up passing. Now, of course, we really want to do something like this. We really want to do this, right? We really want to go and render an index page and maybe some other stuff, maybe a title. Of course, that'll fail, right? Because we can't render anything. It's giving us our standard, it's giving us a 500 error, which would have been, hey, look, you didn't specify any kind of render engine. So we go over here and we say swig equals require swig. And we're going to have to make sure that we install it. This is not a dev, so we just save it. And we do our standard swig set defaults hash false. And we'll go over here with our app, and we'll say app set view engine HTML. App, we're going to say we're going to use an HTML engine, which is going to use swig render file. And of course, this will end up failing too. This will be our error. We know what this one is. This is a look, I can't find your files, right? So we go back here. Now, remember I told you there was going to be some flags that we're going to want to turn on? I'm going to show you that in a second. So if I go over here and I say, I add some views. I'll add my index HTML. My tests are not running, okay? And the reason my tests are not running is NodeMon by default will just end up looking at JavaScript files, okay? But NodeMon has flags that you could use. I could stop and start and do that. NodeMon has some flags, and what I could do here is that when I run my tests, before I end up running, after I specify NodeMon, I could say, hey, look, the extensions I want you to look at are JS and HTML. Meaning if I add an HTML file, I want you to restart. Now again, I've got to restart for. The error that I should get here is that, hey, look, it was a 200, but you have nothing in that index page. But now I can start building this out a little bit at a time. I could say index extends layout.html. I could say I assume I'm going to have on my index page a block or content. Sometimes I call it main, sometimes I call it content. I could end my block. Okay. And now I could go to my, of course, that's not going to work. I'll add my layout. And this is going to be my HTML, my head. Head, we'll say this is going to have a body, end of body, end of HTML. And we'll go over here and we'll put in our block. We'll say block, content, and block. Over here, we'll put in an H2 with our title. That should have our welcome message. Maybe we put in a big H1. Twitter SQL. And that'll be enough for our test to pass. Let me just do another couple of things here, as long as we're here. Again, I'm just going to go back and forth with my route files. So let's take a look at our tests. And let's also say that, hey, look, we also expect to find the word home. And we also expect to find the word tweets. But we want to have a little nav bar for both these things. So now we'll go over here to our back to our views, back to our layout page. This should be failing. But now we'll go over here, and here you can see the content of what ended up getting output. And we'll go over here, and on our page, we've got our title. Let's put a UL. We'll do a class, nav, tabs. All right, so most of you did this for the weekend project. We'll put a list item in. The one thing that I saw on the weekend project, do indexing for your HTML. For our home page, we'll have it / home. So when you get the text, it basically gives you the text and sort of removes all the, well, I guess it gives you the tags too. I shouldn't really say that. And we'll go over here and we'll say this is going to be tweets. So now that works. We could write another test for our routes. Let's do a get. We'll go over here, and let's describe what things are going to look like when we say get for tweets. Let's also say, we'll say it'll return a page with all tweets. And we'll go over here and we'll say, we're going to call get with tweets. We expect the 200, and we expect that we're going to see Mo. We expect we're going to see Larry. We expect we'll see hello. We expect we're going to see world. But again, this is only going to happen if, in fact, we have our, and we'll have those other links as well. Okay. Right now, we're just going to get a 404, not found. Let's also go in here and let's do a before each. And we'll make sure that if we're running this test, we're going to tell our tweet to seed. And when it's done, we'll run. Again, we want to be in control. Since we're using data from our database, we want to be in control of that data, of what's in that database. And of course, if we do that, we're going to have to bring in our tweet, which is going to be require. We go up to our up one level, to our models, tweet. Of course, we still get that same error. It's not going to be that hard for us to go into our routes. So here's our model. Let's actually go into our routes. We don't actually have, right? We've got this app. So now we say what we want to do. We want this to be RESTful. So we say app, we want you to use /tweets. And we want you to require, go up to the routes, go into the routes folder, and load the tweets router. And of course, we don't have that tweets router, so things are going to fail. You go over here, we create a routes folder. We add a tweets.js, and you've done this a bunch of times before. Router. You can do this on one line. Require, express, router. Module, exports, equals router. Now this router is going to be mounted to that /tweets. So now we could say, hey, router, when someone calls get on you, request response next. Now, if we simply just wanted this to pass, we could say tweet equals require. Again, we're in our routes folder. We go up one level to our models to tweet. And we say tweet, get tweets. Remember I told you your routes should be stupid? I said thin. I didn't say stupid. You know how thin that is? Very little going on inside the route. And now we could take, if we just wanted this to pass, we could say response dot, it's not going to quite pass. We could say response dot send tweets. And what do we forget to do here? Get tweets, because don't forget, here we want to get all the tweets, so we have to pass in null for the user. And we'll still get some errors because we're not finding our home and stuff like that. So really, we don't want to send. We want to do render tweets. We'll put a object here, tweets equals tweets. For title, we could say tweets. And all we need to do is go into our views folder, add a tweets.html. Again, we're going to end up extending our layout. And we'll go over here and we'll say this is going to be a block where our content lives. And we'll go over here, and here we'll say UL class. I'm gonna end up using Bootstrap at some point. And here we're gonna do a repeat. So we'll say for tweet in tweets. And we'll go over here and we'll put a list item. And we know we're going to want to have the tweet itself. So we'll say tweet.content. And let's actually create a link. And this will be for our tweets. And this is going to be our tweet. Remember, has a user property, and the user has a name. And we'll want to display that name. So we'll say tweet.user.name. And if we end up doing that, our test should end up passing. Now let's test one more route. This will be a little bit easier. But the route that we'll do here is we'll say we're going to want to test tweets. And we'll do the same seeding here, but now not all tweets. Here we'll say get tweets Mo returns a page with Mo's tweets. So if we call this and we pass in Mo, let's see what happens with our results. All right. So again, we don't have a route for that. So to get a route for that, what we can do is we can actually go into our routes. There's going to be our tweets. And we could pretty much copy this. We'll say we're going to pass in a name. And here we'll say request params.name. And let's assume, we'll do a little happy path here. Let's assume that we have names. And if we have names, we'll say tweets from. And I'll go over here and I'll say plus. Let's go over here and we'll say user equals tweet 0 by user. And so if in fact we have tweets, we'll go over here and we'll say tweets from user.name. And we could also, this is going to come in pretty handy, pass back the user as well. Now if we end up doing that, we've got our route. And this is going to fail. And the reason why it ends up failing is that we don't expect to have Larry. And now we end up passing. Okay? We've actually got our routes. We can actually start running this up. There's one more test we should probably run. And that's the test that's going to be able to create a tweet. So what do we expect that to do? Well, let's write a test for it. So I'm going to go up here. And we'll do a description for post to tweets. And we'll say what happens when you insert a tweet? Well, what it should do is it should redirect to that user's page, right? We'll say it redirects to the user's page. What do we expect that to look like? Well, we're going to tell our client this time we're going to post. And we're going to post to tweets. Right now, that route doesn't exist. We're also going to send some data. Okay? We're going to send content equals foo. And we'll say name equals bar. And we're going to expect that we're going to get a 302 back. A 302 is a redirect. And when we say end, we'll say error, result. And so what this is actually able to do is this is going to look at the result that comes back. That result is going to have a header. The way that a 302 works is a 302 has a status of 302 and a location that tells you where you want to redirect. So what do we expect to have come back? Well, we expect that what we're going to get is a, first of all, we'll say if error, done with the error, and we get out of there. Otherwise, what we're going to say is that we expect result.header.location to equal, and we expect this to be tweets slash, and our user's name is Bart. And after that, we're done. Now, of course, we won't get that far. All right, we get a 404, not found. But if we end up going into our routes, now we're going to do a route, put it up here, router.post to slash, function request, response next. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say, hey, tweet, create tweet, right? We're sending in the content first, request, body, because this is going to be a form post, content, request body, name, callback here. Again, we're not really even returning anything from this. But what we expect to have happen when we come back is to say response, we want to redirect you to tweets, and we want you to go to that user, and that's going to be request.body.name. Now, looks good to me. What do you think we forgot? Body parser, right? Can't find content of undefined. So we could go in, we could put in our body parser. You need to save this. Other thing that I saw a lot of people were doing in the assignment is putting their body parser in routers. Don't put it in routers. You're going to use body parser, you're going to use it for the whole application. Not going to use it in some routes and not use it in other routes. At least I can't think of an example where you would do that. Loaded my package JSON file. Now I'm going to go to my app. So here's my app. I'll say body parser. Sorry. So I'm going to go over here. I'll say require body parser. And I'm going to use the body parser, app.use body parser. And the one that I want is URL encoded. I'm not doing anything fancy with it, so I don't need it to do any fancy parsing. Extended false. Okay. Now I've got my body parser. The only thing that I'm going to end up doing, just so I could actually run this thing, is on my tweets page. So on my views, on my tweets page, I'm just going to go over here, and I'm going to put in a div class is form. We don't need that class. I'll put a form in here. A class as well. And I'll say div, and I'll say form. Method is going to be post. Action is going to be tweets, right? RESTful routes. I'll put in 2 form groups. And I'll put in a label. And this is going to be, call it tweet. And here I could actually give a text area I'll say class equals form control. Name is going to be content. And I'll do the same thing. And I'll go over here. And this is going to be user. This could be a text area. And I'll go in here and I'll say, input class equals form control. My name here is going to actually be name. And the only thing that I'll do here is I'll say if user value equals user name, I could do and if. And the only thing that I want to do is just to give myself a little navigation here. I'll say if we have a user, that means let's just have some way of getting back. So if in fact we have a user, let's say right, so let's just see. It looks like something is barking at me here. I think I forgot to close my input. Say it again?
Type text on the input.
You know, by default, it'll be type text. So if I go over here, so I've got two scenarios with this view. Either I have a user or I don't have a user. I have a user if I'm on that user's page. So at this point, let's just see if my tests run. I've broken anything. All right, all my tests seem to be passing. So now my last stage of the game is I want to be able to go up to my package JSON file. And here, what I want to do, this is going to be start. And this, I don't want it to use my test database. I think I just have a Twitter DB. If I don't, I'm going to have to create one. And here I just want to run node, and this is going to be server.js, of course, which doesn't exist. So I'm going to have two parameters that I'll pass in here. I'll say port equals 3000. Now the only thing that I need to do is go over here, create my server.js. My server.js is just going to be an HTTP server. I can create. If I create that HTTP server, the HTTP server, if I give it basically routes, which I can get from an Express application, I can say use the app. Then I could say server.listen, process, environment, port, and do a callback here. And say console.log, listening on port, plus process environment.port. So now if we do npm start, moment of truth, and let's open this up. So let's say localhost 3000. And here's our home. Here's our tweets. And what did I forget? I forgot my submit button. Let's add that in. So this is on our tweets page. Right, we want to have our button type equals submit, class equals btn primary, insert tweet, And the other, just last thing that we'll do here is on our layout page, let's bring in Bootstrap. We'll say link, it's a style sheet. The href to it is going to be /bootstrap dist css bootstrap.css. And the last thing that we're going to need to do is actually install Bootstrap. We'll say npm install Bootstrap, save, and I just need to put in my static route. My static route is going to go into my app file. And so I like to put this immediately after my app.use express.static. And I like to do my path.join, directory name, node modules. It just joins up the path. And I could go in and bring in my path equals require path. If my test pass means I'm in decent shape, still passing. Now if I go back here, if I forgot the wrong syntax here, load all. And we could always go here if you see that something is not loading, right? You could always load, let's see if I'm missing my style sheet or if I forgot something else. Say it again. So this is going to be on my layout page. Did I spell Bootstrap wrong? Bootstrap dist. Bootstrap dist CSS bootstrap.css. And let's just see if yeah, that should work, I think. Let's see something. Anyone see anything? No. Dist CSS bootstrap.css. Let's make sure that I've got my static. It seems to me that if anything is wrong, it's my static route. You know, did I do node or did I do node mod? Oh, that's why. Let's go back over here. And let's restart it. Now, we've got something, looks a little bit better, not great. I think probably by just going into our layout page and wrapping this into a container. I think I forgot it needs to be class nav and nav tabs. And let me block my content into a container. Now, let's try that. So there are my tweets. There's my navigation bar. Here are my tweets. Here's my home. Hello from Joe. It should end up going to Joe's page, which it does. Stays on the page. I decide to do Shep. Ends up going to Shep's page. The only thing that's missing from here is to highlight the navigation items. And that you could do pretty easily by doing something like, we could say, if path doesn't exist yet, equals home, active, class equals active, Again, this is just bootstrap stuff. And end this if. And I could copy this. Come back here. And all I need to do is go back up to my routes. So I've got my one route here. And just say this is path home. And let me go to my tweets routes for these two routes. I'll say path tweets and path tweets. And now if I just go back to my, I think I did one thing wrong here. This should be if path equals tweets. Now, we should have, if we restart, so here are tweets, and here's home, and we could always end up building it out. So I know that that definitely went on for longer than I wanted to go on, but I really felt it was important to sort of go through that from the beginning to the end.